I learned the truth by accident, in a room where no one expected me to understand what I was hearing. At the time, I was still using a cane. My left leg dragged slightly when I was tired, and I was tired most of the time. The injury had happened 8 months earlier, after a highway collision outside Cedar Rapids. A semi drifted across the center line during freezing rain. I survived, but recovery had been slow and uneven. I moved back into my mother's house afterward because I didn't have another option. It was the same house I grew up in, 2 stories, white siding, a narrow front porch with railings my grandfather had built by hand. It sat on land my mother had inherited from her parents. She had owned it long before she ever met Daniel Mercer. Daniel became my stepdad when I was 16. He never adopted me. It was never formally discussed. At the time, it didn't seem important. He was present. He worked as an insurance adjuster. He paid bills on time. He kept records in labeled folders. He had a quiet voice and steady routines. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't openly hostile either. He existed in the house more like a permanent guest who had gradually taken on authority. My mother, Carol, died in late January. It was sudden, a stroke while she was alone in the kitchen. Daniel found her when he came home from work. She was still alive when the ambulance arrived, but she never regained consciousness. The funeral happened 4 days later. February was cold that year. The ground was hard, and the wind moved across the cemetery without obstruction. Daniel stood beside me the entire time. He shook hands, he accepted condolences, he didn't cry. Afterward, we returned to the house. People filled the living room. Coffee brewed constantly. Paper plates stacked beside trays of food no one touched. Daniel spoke with neighbors and relatives in low, controlled conversations. He answered questions with short, practical responses. I stayed mostly in the recliner near the window. My leg couldn't tolerate standing for long periods, and I didn't want to talk anyway. Within 2 weeks, the house became quiet again. That was when things began to change. Daniel started reorganizing. At first, it seemed like normal behavior. He cleaned out drawers. He moved my mother's clothes into boxes. He said he wanted to donate them. He removed photographs from the hallway. He took down the framed pictures of my grandparents. He replaced them with blank wall space. He worked methodically. Every evening after dinner, he handled another section of the house. He didn't ask for my input. He didn't announce what he was doing. He just did it. I assumed he was grieving in his own way. At the time, I didn't question it. I had my own problems: physical therapy appointments, follow-up visits, insurance disputes related to the accident, pain that came and went unpredictably. I wasn't paying attention to paperwork. I wasn't paying attention to ownership. I wasn't paying attention to anything beyond getting through each day. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel began having phone conversations in his office with the door closed. I noticed because he had never done that before. He usually took calls in the kitchen or living room. Now he shut himself inside. His voice stayed calm, but it dropped lower. He spoke in careful sentences. He repeated specific phrases: estate processing, transfer timeline, property valuation. At the time, those words didn't register. I assumed it was administrative cleanup after my mother's death. I didn't realize those conversations were about removing me. The first direct shift happened on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my cane leaning against the chair. Daniel walked in fully dressed for work. He placed a folded document on the table in front of me. He didn't sit down. He didn't soften his voice. He just said, "We need to discuss your living arrangements." I remember staring at the paper without touching it. I asked him what he meant. He told me the house would be sold. He said he intended to relocate. He said it would be easier for everyone as I found somewhere else to live. He said it in the same tone he used to discuss replacing a water heater. I reminded him I was still in physical therapy. He nodded. He said he understood. He said I had time. He didn't specify how much. I asked him where he expected me to go. He shrugged slightly. He said I was an adult. I was 27 at the time. Legally, he was correct. Physically, I wasn't independent yet. He left the document on the table and went to work. I didn't read it right away. I sat there for nearly an hour trying to understand the shift in tone. He had lived in that house for 11 years. My mother had lived there for her entire life. I had assumed things would remain stable, at least temporarily. I eventually unfolded the paper. It wasn't a notice. It wasn't an eviction. It was a property valuation estimate. The house was listed at $348,000. Seeing that number made something feel distant and abstract. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like an asset. That afternoon, I called my aunt, Rebecca. She was my mother's younger sister. She lived in Des Moines. She had always been direct. I told her Daniel planned to sell the house. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a question I hadn't considered. "Did your mom have a will?" I told her I didn't know. She said she would check. 2 days later, she called back. Her voice sounded different, more focused. She told me she had located a will from several years earlier. It had been filed with an attorney in Cedar Rapids. My mother had listed her assets clearly: the house, the land, her savings accounts, her retirement fund. Rebecca paused before continuing. She said, "Daniel doesn't automatically get all of it." I didn't understand what she meant. She explained Iowa inheritance law in simple terms. Because Daniel had never adopted me, I remained my mother's biological heir. Because the property had originated from my mother's family, and because of how the estate was structured, I was entitled to a share. Not a small share. Half. 50%. I remember sitting in silence after she said that. I asked her if she was certain. She said yes. She said the law was clear. She said Daniel would know this. That was the first time something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. That night, Daniel came home late. He ate dinner quietly. He didn't mention the estate. He didn't mention the house. He didn't mention my future. He went to his office again and closed the door. I stayed in the living room. I could hear his voice faintly through the wall. He spoke with the same calm tone. He used the same phrases: transfer finalized, ownership confirmation, listing readiness. I sat there listening, holding information he didn't know I had, and for the first time I began to understand that whatever was happening inside that office, it wasn't something he planned to explain to me. 3 weeks later, a real estate agent named Melissa Grant walked through the house with a clipboard. Daniel introduced her briefly. He referred to the property as his. He said, "I'm preparing to sell." He didn't look at me when he said it. Melissa nodded professionally. She took measurements. She photographed rooms. She spoke about staging and listing schedules. I stayed in the corner of the living room, leaning on my cane, watching someone prepare to sell a place I believed was still partly mine. Daniel never mentioned my legal share. He never asked me to sign anything. He never acknowledged my ownership. He behaved as though I was already gone. 2 months after my mother's death, he told me I needed to leave by the end of April. He said he had accepted an offer on the house. He said the closing date was approaching. He said it calmly. He said it as if it were inevitable. I didn't argue. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I simply nodded. Because by then, I had already begun making calls of my own, and I had started learning exactly how much of what he was selling didn't belong to him alone. November 2015 was when everything stopped making sense. My mother, Carol Whitaker, died on a Thursday morning. She had gone into the kitchen to make coffee before work. Daniel found her on the floor when he came back inside to grab his briefcase. The paramedics said it was a massive stroke. They used words like instantaneous and catastrophic, words meant to explain something that couldn't really be explained. I didn't see her before they took her away. By the time I got there, the house was already quiet again. For the first few days, I operated automatically. There were phone calls, paperwork, arrangements. I answered questions without thinking about the answers. People spoke to me with a softness they hadn't used before, as if volume alone could break something fragile. The funeral happened 4 days later. It was cold enough that morning for our breath to show in the air. I remember standing beside Daniel near the front of the room. He wore a dark gray suit he reserved for formal occasions. His posture was straight. His expression stayed level. He shook hands with everyone who approached him. He thanked them for coming. He accepted their condolences with a steady voice. No one questioned his composure. They saw a husband managing loss. I saw someone already adjusting to a new structure. At the time, I didn't have the energy to examine it. Grief doesn't arrive as one emotion. It arrives as absence, empty spaces where something used to exist. My mother had been the person I called for everything. She knew details about my life no one else tracked. She remembered appointments. She asked questions no one else asked. Without her, the house felt larger and less defined. For the first week, Daniel and I moved around each other carefully. He stayed in his routines. He woke up at the same time. He went to work. He returned at 6 in the evening. He watched the news. He ate dinner quietly. He didn't talk about her. He didn't ask me how I was doing. He didn't offer comfort. He simply continued. The first red flag came 10 days after the funeral. I was sitting in the living room when I noticed my mother's jewelry box was missing from the shelf near the hallway mirror. It had always been there, a small wooden box with carved edges. She kept it within reach. I asked Daniel if he had moved it. He didn't look up from his laptop. He said he had already sorted her personal items. He said it was easier that way. I asked where the jewelry was. He said it was taken care of. He didn't elaborate. His tone didn't invite follow-up. I let it go. At the time, I told myself he was grieving in his own way. But over the next 2 weeks, more things disappeared. Photo albums from the hallway cabinet, documents from her desk, her phone, her handwriting from the notepad beside the kitchen landline. Small things, personal things, the physical evidence that she had existed in that space. When I asked about them, Daniel gave short answers. He said he was organizing. He said he was simplifying. He said it was necessary. He never included me. He never asked what I wanted to keep. One afternoon, I opened the filing cabinet in his office while he was at work. It wasn't something I had done before. Inside, I saw folders labeled with my mother's name, accounts, property, insurance, and one labeled simply estate. I didn't open it. Not then. I closed the drawer and left the room. I wasn't ready to see what was inside. A few days later, I noticed Daniel had started locking the office door when he left. That was new. He had never done that before. Around that same time, he began taking more phone calls. He kept his voice low. He closed doors. He stepped outside to finish conversations. I heard fragments: transfer process, documentation, title, words that carried legal weight, words I didn't fully understand yet. One evening, about 6 weeks after the funeral, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. He folded his hands in front of him. He said he needed to discuss future plans. He told me he was considering selling the house. He said it calmly. He said it like a logistical update. I asked why. He said it didn't make sense for him to stay there alone. He didn't acknowledge that I was still living there. He didn't acknowledge that it had been my home long before he arrived. I asked when he was planning to sell. He said, soon. That was the first time I felt something shift beneath the surface. Not anger, not panic, just awareness that the stability I assumed was temporary. 2 weeks later, I noticed another change. Daniel stopped referring to the house as ours. He called it my property. The wording was subtle, but it was consistent. He said things like, I need to prepare my property for listing, or I'm meeting someone about my property tomorrow. He never corrected himself. He never clarified. He spoke with certainty. I didn't challenge him. At that point, I still believed he was operating within rights I didn't understand. I still believed he would eventually include me in the conversation, but he never did. Then, about 2 months after my mother died, he brought someone to the house without warning. Her name was Melissa Grant. She was a real estate agent. She walked through every room with a clipboard. She took measurements. She photographed the kitchen. She asked Daniel questions about renovations and timelines. She didn't ask me anything. Daniel introduced me briefly. He referred to me as Carol's son, not his stepson, just an identifier connected to someone who was no longer there. They stood in the living room discussing listing prices. Daniel spoke confidently. He said he expected the house to sell quickly. He said he was ready to move forward. He didn't look at me once during that conversation. I sat in the chair near the window, holding my cane, listening to him describe the sale of a house I had always believed was partly mine. He never mentioned my name in connection to ownership. He never acknowledged my position. He spoke as if the outcome was already settled. That night, after Melissa left, I asked him directly. I asked what would happen to me. He paused for a moment. Then he said, "You're an adult now. You'll figure something out." He didn't say it harshly. He didn't raise his voice. He just stated it plainly. It was the first time he made it clear that he didn't see me as part of whatever came next. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for hours. I kept replaying the conversations, the missing items, the locked office, the phone calls, the quiet certainty in his voice. At the time, I still didn't know the law. I still didn't know what I was entitled to, but I understood one thing clearly. Daniel Mercer wasn't preparing a future that included me. By February, Daniel wasn't coming home alone anymore. He didn't announce it. He didn't sit me down or explain anything. I understood it the first night I heard a second set of footsteps in the hallway after midnight. Soft, careful, someone unfamiliar with the layout. I stayed in my room and listened. The next morning, there was a woman standing in the kitchen. She looked to be in her early 50s, short brown hair, calm posture. She wore one of my mother's sweaters. I recognized it immediately. It was light blue with small buttons down the front. My mother wore it often during winter. The woman introduced herself as Linda Halverson. Her voice was polite, neutral. She said she and Daniel had known each other for a while. Daniel stood beside her pouring coffee as if this was a normal introduction. He didn't explain further. He didn't acknowledge the timeline. He didn't acknowledge what it meant. Linda began appearing regularly after that. At first she stayed overnight occasionally, then she stayed most nights. Then she stopped leaving at all. Her presence filled the house gradually, her shoes near the door, her voice on the phone in the living room, her groceries in the refrigerator, her laundry in the machine. She moved through the house comfortably. She slept in my mother's bedroom. I knew that without asking. The doors stayed closed at night, and I heard movement inside it that no longer belonged to my mother. Daniel didn't ask how I felt about it. He didn't ask if I was ready. He simply continued forward. At the same time, my own situation was becoming more fragile. My physical recovery had stalled. The nerve damage in my leg wasn't improving as expected. My doctor had begun discussing long-term limitations. He used words like chronic impairment. He recommended I apply for disability support. I filed the paperwork in early February. The process was slow. There were forms, evaluations, waiting periods. Every step required approval from someone I would never meet. I had no income, no savings. I depended entirely on the house for stability. Daniel knew this. He saw the paperwork on the kitchen table. He saw the medical letters. He never asked about the outcome. By March, Linda had begun reorganizing the house. She didn't ask permission. She replaced curtains. She rearranged cabinets. She moved furniture. She referred to the bedroom as our room when speaking to Daniel. She spoke about future plans in casual terms. She used phrases like when we sell and when we move. She spoke as if my mother had never existed there. One afternoon, I came home from a physical therapy appointment and found Linda in the hallway holding a cardboard box. Inside it were photographs, family photographs. Pictures of my mother holding me as a child. Pictures from holidays, birthdays, graduations. She said she was sorting old items. I asked her where they were going. She said Daniel would decide. She carried the box into his office and closed the door. I never saw those photographs again. The house began to feel unfamiliar. Not physically. Structurally, everything was the same, but the meaning of it had shifted. I moved through it more carefully. I spoke less. I stayed in my room longer. Daniel and Linda operated as a unit. They spoke quietly. They made plans together. I existed on the edge of those plans. Then, in early April, Daniel asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. Linda wasn't present. He spoke calmly. He said Linda would be moving in permanently. He said they were preparing for the house sale. He said it was time for me to make arrangements. I asked how much time I had. He said, a few weeks. He didn't provide an exact date. He didn't offer assistance. He didn't suggest alternatives. He presented it as a conclusion. I reminded him about my disability application. I reminded him I had no income yet. He nodded. He understood. His expression didn't change. He said I needed to start planning. After that conversation, I began packing slowly. Not because I had somewhere to go, just because I understood the direction things were moving. I packed clothes first, then books, then personal items. There weren't many. Most of what mattered had already disappeared. One evening, I asked Daniel about my mother's ashes. He said they were in his possession. He didn't say where. I asked if I could have them. He said he wasn't ready to discuss that yet. He said he needed time. He never brought it up again. By late April, Linda's presence was complete. Her voice filled the house. Her routines replaced my mother's routines. She cooked in the kitchen. She answered the phone. She spoke to neighbors as if she had always lived there. I became a temporary occupant in a place I had once belonged. The final conversation happened on a Monday morning. Daniel stood in the hallway outside my room. He didn't come inside. He said the closing date for the house was scheduled. He said I needed to be out before then. He gave me 2 weeks. He said it calmly. He said it without hesitation. I asked if he could give me more time. I asked him where he expected me to go. He said I would figure it out. He turned and walked away. That was the entire conversation. 2 weeks later, I packed the last of my belongings into the trunk of my car. Clothes, medical documents, a few personal items. Things that fit into boxes. Things that could be carried. I walked through the house one last time before leaving. The walls were bare. The rooms were staged for sale. Linda stood in the kitchen speaking to someone on the phone. Daniel was in his office. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. I stepped outside and closed the front door behind me. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stay there. For the next several weeks, I lived out of that car. I parked in different places each night. Store parking lots, public streets, anywhere that didn't draw attention. I kept my belongings in the trunk. I used a gym membership to shower. I ate cheaply. I attended medical appointments during the day and returned to the car at night. I called the disability office repeatedly. They told me to wait. Everything required waiting. One afternoon, while sitting in the public library, I received a call from my Aunt Rebecca. She told me she had spoken with an attorney. She told me something that changed everything. She said Daniel had never adopted me. She said that mattered. She said under Iowa law, I wasn't just a guest in that house. I was an heir. I was entitled to half of my mother's estate, half of the house, half of everything he had sold. I remember holding the phone in silence after she said it, because suddenly the past few months looked different. The speed, the secrecy, the urgency, the way Daniel had removed items, the way he had never mentioned my legal share, the way he had forced me out before the sale closed. He had never acknowledged my ownership, not once. And sitting there in that library with everything I owned in the trunk of my car, I realized something that hadn't been clear before. Daniel Mercer hadn't just removed me from the house, he had removed me from something I legally still owned. By 2018, my life had settled into something quieter. Not stable, not secure, but quieter. My disability claim had finally been approved after nearly 2 years of reviews, appeals, and medical evaluations. The approval didn't come with relief so much as confirmation. It meant the limitations my doctors had described were now permanent enough to qualify under federal criteria. It meant the life I had before the accident wasn't coming back. I was living in transitional housing in Davenport, a small one-bedroom unit in a converted brick building that used to be offices. The floors creaked, the windows didn't seal properly in winter, but it was mine, at least temporarily. For the first time since leaving my mother's house, I had a fixed address. Most days were slow. Physical therapy had ended. My routine consisted of medical appointments, paperwork, and long stretches of waiting. Waiting for decisions, waiting for responses, waiting for some kind of forward movement. One afternoon, I was sitting at the small kitchen table with my laptop open.
I wasn't searching for anything specific. I had developed a habit of reading legal and financial forums, not because I had any expertise, but because I was trying to understand systems I had once trusted other people to handle. I clicked on a thread titled, "What happens if a parent dies without a will in Iowa?" The question itself didn't stand out at first. It was just another post among thousands. But the responses were precise. One reply explained intestate succession law in Iowa. It said that when someone dies without a valid will, their estate doesn't automatically go entirely to the surviving spouse if they have biological children. It said the estate is divided. The surviving spouse receives a portion. The biological children receive a portion. The percentages depended on specific circumstances. I kept reading. Another reply clarified further. If the surviving spouse was not the biological parent of the deceased's child, and if that child had never been legally adopted by the spouse, the child remained a direct heir under Iowa law. The estate would be split, 50% to the surviving spouse, 50% to the biological child. I read that line several times. I didn't move. I didn't breathe normally. I just stared at the screen. Because Daniel Mercer had never adopted me. Not when I was 16, not when I was 18, not ever. Legally, he was my mother's husband, but he was never my legal parent. Which meant, under Iowa law, I hadn't just lived in that house, I had owned half of it. Not symbolically, not emotionally, legally. Half. My mind began reconstructing everything that had happened after her death. The phone calls, the locked office, the paperwork I wasn't allowed to see, the speed of the sale, the way he never mentioned inheritance, never mentioned division, never mentioned my name in connection to ownership. I opened another browser tab and searched property records for Lynn County. Public access records showed the transaction history. The house had sold in March 2017. Sale price, $240,000. I stared at the number. Half of that was $120,000. I kept searching. Vehicle registration records showed my mother's car had been transferred and sold. Bank accounts had been closed. Her retirement account had been distributed. I didn't know the exact balances, but I knew she had been financially careful. She had worked for the same employer for 28 years. She had saved consistently. She had planned for stability. And every part of that stability had passed through Daniel's control, without my involvement, without my consent, without acknowledgement. I leaned back in the chair and tried to process it. Not the money itself, but the sequence. He had started removing items immediately. He had secured documents quickly. He had contacted agents and attorneys early. He finalized sales while I was still living in my car. He had never once said, "You have a share in this." He had never said, "This belongs partly to you." He had behaved as if I had no legal connection to any of it. I sat there for a long time, replaying specific conversations. The day he told me to leave, the way he stood in the hallway, calm and certain, the way he avoided details, the way he never hesitated. At the time, I had assumed he held authority I didn't question. Now I understood something else was possible. He may have understood the law. He worked in insurance. He dealt with claims and property evaluations. He understood documentation. He understood liability. It would have been routine for him to consult an estate attorney. Routine for him to learn how intestate succession worked. Routine for him to learn that I remained an heir. And yet, he never said it. Not once. I opened another document and began writing down dates. January 2016, my mother died. February 2016, he began estate processing. March 2017, house sold. April 2017, I was already gone.
By the time the sale closed, I had been sleeping in parking lots, while he finalized transactions involving property I legally owned. I didn't feel anger immediately. What I felt first was clarity. The kind that arrives slowly, then all at once. Every decision he made after her death had direction. Every action had timing. Every conversation avoided acknowledgement of my position. He had moved with efficiency. He had removed obstacles, including me. I sat there in that small apartment with the laptop still open, understanding something that had been invisible to me when it mattered most. The house hadn't just been my childhood home. It had been my legal inheritance, and Daniel Mercer had sold it while I was still alive. I didn't call a lawyer right away. For several days after discovering the law, I kept the information to myself. I reread the statutes online. I cross-checked multiple sources. I wanted to be certain I wasn't misunderstanding something. Legal language leaves room for interpretation, and I had learned not to trust my first reading of anything important. But the conclusion stayed the same. Under Iowa law, I had been an heir. I had never signed anything relinquishing that status. No one had explained it to me. No one had asked me to participate in estate proceedings. I existed outside the process entirely. Eventually, I began making calls. The first attorney's office listened briefly and then told me they couldn't help. The second said the same.
The third told me estate disputes were complicated and asked when the death had occurred. When I told them 2016, they paused and said timing could be an issue. The fourth office didn't return my call. By the time I reached the seventh attorney, I had learned how to explain the situation clearly. Dates, names, property sale, lack of disclosure. The attorney's name was Michael Brennan. His office was in Cedar Rapids, less than a mile from the hospital where my mother had died. He agreed to meet with me. I remember sitting across from him in a small office with beige walls and framed certificates. He listened without interrupting. He took notes occasionally. He asked specific questions about adoption status, estate filings, and property transfers. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. He said timing mattered. He explained that Iowa had statutes governing how long someone had to challenge estate administration. These deadlines existed to create finality. Without them, property ownership could remain uncertain indefinitely. But he also said something else. He said those timelines could be affected if an heir had never been properly notified, if information had been withheld, if someone had proceeded without disclosing known heirs. He didn't promise an outcome. He didn't suggest certainty. He said there were two possible paths. One involved attempting to reopen the estate. The other involved filing a civil claim directly against Daniel. He explained terms I had never heard before: unjust enrichment, breach of fiduciary duty, failure to notify heirs. Each phrase described a form of responsibility. Each phrase described obligations Daniel may have held. Michael said civil litigation would require evidence, documentation, records. He said it would take time. He said Daniel would defend himself. He said nothing would happen quickly. I asked him one question. I asked if it was still possible. He paused before answering. Then he said yes. That was enough. We filed the complaint in early 2019. Seeing Daniel Mercer's name listed as a defendant in an official document felt unfamiliar. For years, he had existed in my mind as someone who had simply moved on, someone whose decisions had shaped my life without consequence. Now, his actions were being examined formally. He responded through an attorney within weeks. His legal team denied wrongdoing. They stated that estate matters had been handled appropriately.
They stated that timelines had passed. They stated that I had failed to assert claims earlier. The language was formal, controlled, predictable. The case moved forward anyway. The process involved discovery. That meant gathering records, property transfers, financial account closures, communications. Documents that had existed quietly in filing cabinets now became evidence. I had to revisit details I had spent years trying not to revisit. Dates, conversations, movements, each one reconstructed carefully, each one placed in sequence. Daniel and Linda were still together. They had relocated to another part of the state after selling the house. Public records showed their new property purchase, a smaller home, purchased outright. I sometimes wondered if he had anticipated this possibility, if he had believed enough time would pass to prevent questions, if he had assumed I would never learn the law. The case didn't move quickly. Civil litigation rarely does. Months passed, then years. There were hearings, filings, responses, periods of waiting that felt familiar. But the difference this time was that I wasn't invisible within the process. My name existed in the record. My position existed in the record. My mother's estate existed in the record. I lived quietly during that time. My disability payments covered basic expenses. I kept my apartment. I kept my routines. The case existed alongside everything else, moving at its own pace. As of now, it hasn't fully concluded. Both sides have presented arguments. Both sides have produced documentation. The court will eventually decide what those records mean. I don't know exactly how it will end. What I do know is simpler than that. For a long time, I believed I had lost everything the day I left that house. I believed the story had ended there. But it hadn't. It had only paused. And eventually the truth found its way back to me. So that's where things stand now. The trial date is set for later this year. I know the exact date because I've looked at it more times than I want to admit. It's printed on official court letterhead, folded neatly inside a manila folder I keep in the top drawer of my desk. The paper itself is ordinary, plain. It doesn't carry the weight of everything that led up to it. It doesn't reflect the years between the morning my mother died and the afternoon I learned I had never truly been written out of her life. It just sits there, quiet and patient. Daniel Mercer has never contacted me directly, not once. No phone calls, no letters, no attempts to explain anything. Every word that has passed between us since 2017 has gone through attorneys. Structured sentences, formal language, statements written for a record instead of a person. Sometimes I wonder if he expected this, if he anticipated that one day, years later, I would sit in a small apartment and read something that changed the meaning of everything he had done. Or if he believed time itself would be enough to close the door permanently. I haven't seen him in person since the day I carried my last box to my car. I remember he was standing in the hallway when I left. He didn't block the door. He didn't offer help. He just stood there, watching, like someone observing the completion of a task he had already planned.
I didn't realize then how final he believed that moment would be. Now his name appears in legal filings, his actions are described in timelines, his decisions exist as entries in official records. The house exists there too. Address, sale price, transfer date, evidence that it was real, evidence that it changed hands, evidence that I was still alive when it happened.
I still think about that house more often than I expect to. Not because of its value, not because of what it was worth financially, but because of what it represented. Stability, continuity, the sense that certain things remained constant even when everything else changed. I remember specific details with clarity. The sound of the front door closing in winter, the way the kitchen floor creaked near the refrigerator, the narrow strip of sunlight that came through the hallway window every afternoon. I remember my mother standing at the stove, stirring something slowly, asking me questions about my day without looking up. I remember believing, without ever saying it out loud, that I would always be able to come back there. I didn't understand how quickly that assumption could disappear. The legal process has been slow, slower than I expected. There are long stretches where nothing seems to happen. Then suddenly new documents arrive, new responses, new arguments. Each one adds another layer. Each one brings the past into focus in a way that feels both distant and immediate at the same time. Sometimes, late at night, I sit at my desk and reread the timeline Michael helped me assemble. Dates aligned in sequence, events connected by paperwork instead of memory. January 2016, my mother died. February 2016, estate processing began. April 2017, property listed. March 2017, property sold. April 2017, I left. Seeing it written like that makes everything look orderly, but living through it never felt orderly. It felt quiet, gradual, like watching something familiar change shape without realizing it was happening until it was already finished. The court will eventually decide what those changes mean, whether they were lawful, whether they were final, or whether they were incomplete. Until then, I continue living the life I've rebuilt piece by piece. I still have limitations from the accident. My leg still aches in cold weather. I still move more carefully than I used to. But I have stability now, a place that belongs to me, even if only through a lease, a routine that doesn't depend on anyone else's decisions. And I have something else I didn't have before. Clarity. Not certainty about the outcome, but clarity about what happened. For a long time, I believed that chapter of my life had ended in that driveway, that whatever Daniel Mercer had done was permanent, that whatever I lost was gone beyond reach. I don't know yet how this will end. I don't know whether the court will agree with my understanding or his, but I do know that the story didn't end the way he thought it did. It kept going, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when everything that had been left unsaid would finally be acknowledged. If you want to follow what happens next, subscribe so you don't miss the outcome when the verdict is finally reached. Like this story if you want me to share the full courtroom experience when it happens. And in the comments, tell me this. If you were in my position and you found out years later that the person you trusted most had quietly taken what was legally yours, would you confront them or would you walk away and never look back?